3. Wrecked. One supper was, if anything, rather worse than Lone Wolf had anticipated. In fact, it was worse than he could have imagined possible. The ship's cook had thrown together yesterday's leftovers and hoped for the best. The result was vile. Lone Wolf couldn't work out whether he was pleased or regretful that the helpings were so small. He tried not to think about what he was eating. Those black things were either raisins or rat turds, and he suspected the latter. He tried not to think, too, about what the rest of the meals would be like before they reached port backs. Delicious, snapped Captain Kelman as he finished eating, looking sharply around him, making it plain that he would brook no argument. Aside from Lone Wolf and the captain, there was a handful of nervous crewmen around the table. The conversation over the meal had been slow and stilted. Lone Wolf suspected that the men would have been much happier eating below decks. They looked shiftily at each other and muttered approvingly about the food. Lone Wolf allowed himself an inward smile. He'd seen their real opinions in their faces while they'd been eating. One by one the crewmen made their apologies and left the cabin, until only Lone Wolf and the captain remained. The young Kai prepared, likewise, to take his leave, but before he could do so the cook appeared, ready to carry off the dirty dishes. Lone Wolf helped stack the plates and group together the cutlery and condiments. Then Kelman clapped his hands together eagerly. "Samer," the captain shouted. "Sorry, Samer," the captain repeated. "Let's have a game of Samer." Lone Wolf had heard about the game but had never played it. He knew it required a combination of intelligence, bold strategy and bluff as different pieces ward on a patterned board. He was eager to find out what it was like, and told the captain as much, while explaining apologetically that he had little confidence in his own skill. "Nonsense," Kelman boomed. "Soon pick it up. See if you don't. I'll teach you. Be a pleasure. Tell you what, just to make it more interesting, let's put a little wager on the result. I don't think that's course it is. One of the best ideas I ever had. Let's put 10 gold crowns on it. We'll enjoy the game better if we have just a little something at stake. Bet you we will. Another time, perhaps." The captain's voice changed completely, as did his entire posture. "I very much think you ought to play Samer," he said, pronouncing each word with deliberated clarity. But you think I'm just a drunken old man who wants to waste your time playing a silly board game and fleecing you of your money. That's what you're thinking. Am I right?" "Well, not in so many." Kelman smiled, as if he were a friend sharing a secret joke. "In short, I'm right, MMH, and in a way you're perfectly correct, too. I am a drunken old man and, if I get half a chance, I'll win your gold crowns from you. Vashna knows I'm not so rich that I can turn away my winnings, but that's only part of the truth. Just in the same way that saying Samer's just a game is only part of the truth. Let me show you." He pulled a carved wooden box out from under a heap of clothing and placed it on the empty table between them, apologetically blowing the dust off its lid. "Been a long time, young fellow, a long time," he muttered shamefacedly. The hinges gave a rusty squeak of protest as he opened the box, and the back of the lid landed with a crack on the table. The inside of the box was a blackness so deep that it seemed to swallow the light of the flickering lamps, making the room seem suddenly shady and ominous. Yet Lone Wolf was certain he could sense movement from within, as if the box contained a tangle of small, frightened creatures. The movement stopped abruptly. Lone Wolf felt as if someone had run the sharp tip of a blade of fresh grass across the back of his neck. He shivered, hoping the captain wouldn't notice his sudden unease. But Kelman's attention was firmly fixed on what he was doing. He pulled from the box a faded cloth, frayed at the edges and at the folds, and spread it out on the table. Lone Wolf saw that a spiral pattern, made up of many triangles, had long ago been woven into the fabric. Obviously the colors had once been bold and bright, but now they had aged into muted tones of dusty pink and pale blue-gray. His eyes followed the line of the spiral in towards the vortex. Once there, they leapt without his conscious direction out to the outer perimeter once more, before following the spiral inwards again, and then, with a great effort of will he snapped his gaze away. The pattern was like a maze without an exit, in which it would be possible to become lost, forever, beyond all hope of rescue. He recognized its dangers. If he were to play this game, he must beware. The captain had been speaking to him, the words coming to his lips as if they were merely off-the-cuff pleasantries. "Once upon a time," he remarked conversationally, a trace of a smile twitching his mouth, "the gods themselves invented a game, and the game that they invented they called life. The game of life was played on a vast board which they called Aon, and it had untold millions of pieces, each of which could be moved in untold millions of ways. The game was a very complicated one, as you can imagine, and even the gods found it difficult to remember all the rules and to hold in their minds the rapidly shifting configurations of play. The captain's hands, seemingly independently of the rest of his body, reverently smoothed out the cloth. Its crease lines melted away, and the collars began to glow a little more brightly. The gods find very few things difficult, and so they were captivated by the challenge of this new game. In the infinity of time which they had at their disposal, they planned their strategies, and they countered each other's offensives, and they saw themselves win and lose campaigns. The centuries ticked away, and then the millennia, and still all the gods were absorbed in the game they had invented. There was no room left in their minds to attend to other things, and so Aon, born in hope from the truce between Aesir and Nar, became nothing more than a vast game board, and all the living creatures in it were nothing more than beautifully crafted pieces of matter, to be pushed hither and thither at the whim of the gods. Kelman reached into the box again, and pulled out a handful of whittled wooden figures. They were in the shapes of bizarre, contorted wild beasts, their heads snarling and their teeth sharp. They were like no animals that Lone Wolf had ever seen before, except perhaps in the dark otherworld of dreams. But in time everything repeats itself, said Kelman, so softly that Lone Wolf had to lean forward to catch the words over the creaking of the vessel. The game of life was made up of an enormous pattern, and like any other pattern it had recurring themes. Soon, if a billion years can be called soon, the gods learned to recognize those themes, and the game of life became predictable to them. With predictability came boredom. If all of them knew what the next move was going to be, what it had to be, then where was the interest in carrying on the play? Then one of them, no one knows which it was, but it was almost certainly the minor god called Kinmertha, realized that the game was restricted because all the movements of all of the pieces were prescribed. Although the rules were very complicated, they were still there, and they were fixed and they were rigid. Even if the gods amended the rules, adding new provisions and increasing the options open to the player at every turn, creating new types of pieces with different permissible moves, the game of life would always be finite. At some moment amid all the eons of eternity there would come the time when every possibility of the game would be exhausted, and its pattern would recur. So this minor god, Kinmertha, gave something new to the pieces. He implanted souls in them, little shards of godliness. Now the moves that they could make were no longer inhibited by the minds of the gods. The pieces themselves could choose what they wished to do next. The cloth was covered with a profusion of roughly hewn figurines now, some painted red and some blue, and a few of them painted in a color which Lone Wolf's eyes refused to acknowledge. The captain's hands moved swiftly, placing them in positions that were obviously predetermined yet which seemed to have no underlying rationale. Now that Kinmertha had made this change, there wasn't a pattern to the game of life any longer, and so it could exert all its old fascination on the minds of the gods. Ever since then they have been playing it, and never once has the pattern repeated. Yet there's a pattern there, for all that. Only, it's a pattern without any boundary, endless, a pattern woven across all of Aon, a pattern that no one will ever be able to complete. The captain stopped speaking. Lone Wolf looked at him. It seemed as if he were obliged to say something, to make some form of response. The game of life, he said eventually. The gods are still playing it, aren't they? And were the pieces on their board? Of course, replied Kelman with an almost imperceptible bob of his head. Behind the belligerent bush of his hair his eyes were grave now, fixed on Lone Wolf's own. But, just to make the game a little more interesting, they gamble on the outcome of every move, and, just like Agana addicts, all the time they've had to keep raising the stakes, just to make the game more satisfying. Those stakes are our souls, of course. Realization came to Lone Wolf. What the captain had been telling him need not be in itself the truth. Rather, it was a sort of model of the way things were. Like so many fables, it was made of artificial flesh molded upon a skeleton of reality. He said eagerly, I think I know the rest of your story. Kelman nodded. Over the millennia some of the gods have been knocked out of the game of life, said Lone Wolf, the words stumbling over each other. They've lost all their stakes and they've had to retire. Now there are just 3 of the gods left in the game. Just Aesir and Kai and Nar. The captain gave a little flip of his hand to indicate agreement, to encourage Lone Wolf to keep going. Nearly half of the pieces are in Nar's possession now, and their numbers are roughly matched by those belonging to Aesir and Kai. But there are still a few pieces left over, the last few pieces that will decide who is the winner of the game of life. Kelman had finished arranging the figurines on the cloth. Now he put the box on the floor next to his chair and rested both his elbows on the table. You're very nearly right, my friend. In fact, If you asked Nar or Aishir, they'd say that you'd understood all there is to understand about the game of life. Ha, that's all that they know. But the gods know everything, don't they? Are you sure you want to ask that question? The look in Kelman's eyes was one of disappointment. Clearly Lone Wolf had failed him in some way. Lone Wolf thought for a moment. I see what you mean, he said slowly. If the gods knew everything, then they'd know what the outcome of the game would be. And that'd mean it wouldn't be any fun for them anymore. Correct. By the alveoli of my aunt's monastically inclined great-nephew. But I thought for a moment there you were just as much of a half-wit as all the rest. If they wanted to, the gods could know everything. But they choose not to. They don't want to know exactly what the future holds because, if they did, it would spoil their cursed game for them. Kelman leapt to his feet impulsively and went to the nearest porthole. He looked out through it at the mask of night. When next he spoke, it was as if he were addressing himself to the darkness. Think of it. Just think what those fools of gods are throwing away, laid out in front of them, like the finest painting ever put on canvas, glittering in its myriad colors, is the map of the future, and the buffoons, in what they like to think of as their infinite wisdom, elect to veil their eyes when they look at it. Wisdom. Ha! Give me the wisdom of the drunken crewman thrown out of a dockside bar, or the wisdom of a child playing with a pretty gimcrack toy. Ah, if I were as wise as the gods, you'd look on me as a fool. And there's more. His voice dropped once again to something little more than a whisper. He looked around him, as if afraid that someone might be eavesdropping on what he was saying, cocooned in what they perceive as their omniscience. The gods don't realize that they've made an infinite mistake, a mistake of truly godlike proportions. The game of life, said Lone Wolf, equally quietly, is by design endless. Neither side can ever win the ultimate victory. If Kai and Aishir rejoice in their triumph over Nar, there will still be some evil left in Aeon. And if the King of the Darkness should swallow us here on Magnamund, yet there'll still live on a pocket of good somewhere. Kelman said nothing, but the way in which he was holding his body altered slightly, as if he were smiling with all his limbs. But that means, said Lone Wolf, perplexed, that means that everything we try to do to repel the forces of evil is wasted. Evil is an enemy we can never defeat. His voice became sarcastic. Turn your vessel round and let's head back towards Halmgard. Captain, let me go to King Ulnar and tell him to surrender to Zagarna, because what's the point of carrying on fighting if we know we can never win? Uninvited, he poured himself a glass of Wanlo and half-drained it in a single gulp. Water came to his eyes, disguising the tears that were already forming there. Do you mean that? Asked Kelman, still looking out into the blackness. No, said Lone Wolf bitterly. He put his glass back down on the table a little too firmly, and some of the fiery liquor splashed out over the stained wood. No, of course I don't. I can't throw away everything I believe in just for the sake of a fable. The captain turned to gaze at him frankly. It's no fable, my young comrade, he said. Oh, to be sure, it's been embellished around the edges a little, but that's about all. Do you believe we should give up? Kelman's eyes bulged and he made a noise that couldn't decide whether it was a guffaw of incredulity or a bellow of wrath. Give up? Give up? Are you no wiser than a god? Lone Wolf couldn't think of any reply. The gods might give up, if only they knew. Kelman continued after a long time. That's the way their minds work. Good, evil, white, black, nothing in between the extremes. But the pieces they brought into existence to use in their game, we see things differently. You're not wholly good, are you? I'd wager my own liver, such of it as there is that's left, that there have been things you've done even in your short life that wouldn't bear repeating. And me? Here I am, chosen by Aishir to bear you to Durinur so that, she hopes, her moves in the game can triumph over Nar's. For the moment, you can call me one of Aishir's pieces, but I've done things that would make your backbone tie itself in knots and beg itself for mercy. They made us flawed so that their game would be more interesting. He gulped down some Wanlo straight from the neck of the bottle. They made the whole of Aeon flawed, he added more gently, and there's nothing any of our efforts can do to get rid of every last one of its imperfections. But we can try. By all that's sacred in the Pantheon, we can drive evil back from our world until all that's left of it is a minor irritation. And if we do, it's our decision. The gods don't really care what happens, any more than a gambler with 1,000,000 gold crowns cares about losing 1,000. To the gods it doesn't really matter, it's just a part of their game. But, Lone Wolf stammered, Aishir and Kai, they're on the side of good. Every child knows that. Good. The captain spat, miraculously hitting a spittoon straight on, so that it rang with a deep brassy note. Good and evil are qualities that people know. People and spawn and the dumb animals of the fields and forests. To the gods the word's just a label. Aesir and Kai are said to be on the side of good and Norse forces are described as the forces of evil. But what do the terms mean to the gods? Nothing at all. They're just tags. When we play Samer, one person has blue pieces and the other red. The colors themselves don't matter. They're just different so that we know whose pieces are whose. That's all. Same with the game of life. Norse pieces are called evil, because otherwise they get all mixed up with the pieces called good. Lone Wolf was silent. He realized that what the captain had just been saying to him was blasphemy, or heresy at the very least. In certain parts of Magnamund, indeed, even in the less civilized regions of Sommerland itself, the man would be burnt alive for denigrating the gods like this. Lone Wolf recognized that all of his training was telling him he should be registering fury at Kelman's perception of the actions of the gods, and yet he felt, in striking contrast, that what the man was saying made a bizarre kind of sense. No, not bizarre at all. It explained so many of the things that had been puzzling him, yet he couldn't take the next step, which was to regard the gods as nothing more than the inventions of human minds. It was tempting to think of them that way. Forget about divine powers and universal concepts of good and evil. Humanity was born into the universe and given the choice as to whether it wanted to create heaven or hell. If there were no gods, then life was an irrelevance, a parasite dwelling on the evolving form of Aeon. But, if the gods existed and were as all-powerful as the priests portrayed, then human beings were indeed only carved wooden pieces, moved hither and thither about a game board at the whims of amoral beings. Lone Wolf grimaced wryly. The captain had said that people were all the same, a mixture of good and evil. In the same way, the truth about Aeon must lie somewhere between the two extremes he'd been considering. The gods, he felt certain, existed. No argument. Yet they weren't the selfless beings depicted by the priests. They had failings. When they breathed bits of their soul stuff into the creatures they had made, those failings were part of the overall deal. We were going to play Samer, the captain said. Yes, indeed. Kelman sat down at the table and made trivial changes to the positioning of the carved pieces. If you ask anyone that plays this game, he said, you'll be told that it was invented by a sage called Belian, over 1,000 years ago. But they'd be telling you wrong. What Belian did was to perceive a little of the essence of the game of life, and simplify it down so that we mortals could play it. Lone Wolf knew his face was looking dubious. Oh, yes, said the captain. From now on we're playing with living pieces. Here are my 10 gold crowns. He slapped the money on the table. If I lose, they're yours. But if you lose, well, I trust you have the coins to pay me my due. The wooden animals seemed, in the flickering lamplight, to be moving their heads. Lone Wolf breathed deeply. Show me how to play, he said resignedly too. The game of Samer had hardly any written rules. In fact, hardly any rules at all. The object was to remove all of one's opponent's pieces from the board, just as in so many of the games Lone Wolf had played at the Kai Monastery. But there were distinct differences. The pieces were made of wood and, when they were left untouched, they were little more than static carvings. From time to time Lone Wolf was certain he saw out of the corner of his eye that their facial expressions were changing. But he couldn't be sure, and he preferred to blame the illusion of motion on the guttering of the lamplight. But, when his hand touched a piece, the wood was somehow imbued with a semblance of life, and this was a part of the game. Merely laying his finger on one of the carvings, he discovered, gave that piece some spark of volition, so that it turned willingly to assault the nearest opposing piece. There was no capture in this game. Pieces fought to what looked uncannily like their deaths. On occasion Lone Wolf could hear a thin scream as a contorted wooden creature buckled in agony and then flickered reluctantly out of existence to find itself, he hoped, neatly laid out in the box ready for the next game. The pieces on his side were red, those on Kelman's were blue. At least, this was generally the case. One of the other aspects of the game was that the wooden warriors could bear false collars. There was no way of knowing friend from traitor until one laid one's finger on a piece. If it was what its collar proclaimed it to be, then it moved into action against the foe. But if one had been mistaken, the wooden figurine turned its head and bit painfully. The pattern of allegiances shifted constantly, so that a piece which had been one's own only moments before could now be a turncoat. The way to win the game, Lone Wolf soon realized, was to touch as many pieces as one could as fleetingly as possible. His fingers were bleeding copiously by the time he discovered this. His hands moved almost more quickly than his side across the array, touching lightly here and there. He was hardly aware of the fact that the captains were doing likewise. Sometimes Lone Wolf touched a blue piece by mistake, and usually the reward for his error was another painful bite. But on occasion, he noticed, the figurine would prove to be one of his temporary allies, and turn to savage its erstwhile friend. Time passed. How long? Lone Wolf had no way of knowing. His mind had grown fatigued of hearing the tiny shrieks of lost pieces. All he could think of was that this game, like the game of life itself, was so terribly wasteful. It chewed up souls and spat them out, and all to no guided purpose. He found no satisfaction in the realization that he was driving back the forces marshaled by Captain Kelman. The lacerations on his fingers he healed almost instinctively. They were infuriating interruptions to his tactical plans. All he wanted was that the game be over as soon as possible, so that he could go back to his bunk and find the warm embrace of sleep. He refused to allow the completeness of his attention to be swallowed into the game of Samer. In the end there were only 2 pieces left on the spiral pattern, and both of them were red. They were frozen in mutually hostile snarling poses. I think, said Lone Wolf tiredly, that the game is mine. The captain deliberately poured the dregs of a bottle of Wanlo into his own goblet, gesturing with empty hospitality towards Lone Wolf's glass, and slurred a few words. Are you so certain? Sure, young friend? Those pieces seem to be yours, but are they really? You know that the collar can lie. Perhaps they're really blues, disguising themselves. We wager, said Lone Wolf, discovering in himself an eagerness which until this moment he hadn't realized existed. The green scepter rocked as a sudden gust of wind caught it sidelong. The 2 wooden pieces scrabbled to hold their positions. I'll give you, said Kelman, his movements furred by the Wanlo, a better stake than any I've given before. The wrath of the gods upon this useless gold, he cried, sweeping the coins to the floor. If you win this game against me then I'll give you something in a bottle. A bottle of Wanlo? That's something I think I could well do without. No, a bottle that was given to me by Aishir herself. But I thought you didn't believe in Aishir. Whatever gave you that idea? Sweet Aishir. Like a child to me she was. The tragedy of Captain Kelman became obvious to Lone Wolf. The man had the gift of the gab, and yet all the time he had nothing. You're on, said Lone Wolf appeasingly. I'll stake my 10 gold crowns against your bottle of something. He touched his finger to one of the pieces and it turned, ferociously, trying to bite into his flesh. But he'd moved his hand away too quickly. The wooden fang snapped in empty air. It had been one of his own pieces, one that he'd relied upon during his earlier campaigns. Now it belonged to Kelman, or so it seemed, until the next move. The captain was reluctant to lay his finger upon either piece. He whistled through tense lips, clearly wondering which of the 2 remaining pieces, if either, might now owe him allegiance. The figurines froze, giving him no clues. Kelman spat upon the index finger of his right hand, wishing it luck. His eyes became taut. He moved his head forwards, and Lone Wolf could see that his gaze was being drawn ever inwards towards the vortex of the spiral. I touch this one, said Kelman, and claim my victory. But the piece turned and bit him to the bone. Then it moved nervously in and out of reality, before transmuting itself into a still form, lying in the box. There was now only 1 piece left on the cloth. It was red, and according to the rules, as the solitary piece left, its collar must be honest. The piece belonged to Lone Wolf. I claim victory, said Lone Wolf sadly. I'd wished I wouldn't have to. I'm a fool, said the captain, and a fool and a thrice accursed fool, and even a fool thereafter. I thought I could defeat you, but never mind all of that. Put away your gold coins. They're nothing to me now. I'll give you something in a bottle that's worth more than. His head fell forward onto the table and he began to snore. Lone Wolf tiptoed away, leaving the man where he sprawled. His bunk was beckoning. He threw himself on it, unbuckling his sword and his axe, feeling the softness of the mattress beneath him. He tried to think of the blasphemies which Kelman had told him, but all he could discover in his meaning was that there was a game, and that he was nothing more than a piece in that game. A song rang through his mind. The song had words and music. He tried to capture it, but it refused to be caught. One of these times he'd understand how the gods worked, and when that happened, the song that he'd sing would be the song of Aishir. He slept. 3 Brel woke him in the middle of the night. Lone Wolf, said the crewman urgently, the ship should be in danger. Lone Wolf turned over in his bed, trying to ignore Brel's words, snuggling his face into the softness of his pillow. Brel was annoying him, disturbing his rest. He didn't want anything to do with Brel's problems. That was an end of it. He snuffled loudly. There was a crash of waves. They were trying to beat the bow of the vessel into splinters. Lone Wolf found increased comfort in his pillow. He hoped the words that Brel was speaking would simply go away. Water. The water was washing around the feet of the bunks, threatening him. He told Brel to push off, realizing even as he did so that the crewman was trying to save his life. He knew there was something terribly wrong, but at the same time he seemed to be utterly distanced from it, as if he were watching actors in a play. Yet he was fully conscious of the fact that his body was being thrown from side to side, and not just by Brel's attempts to waken him. And there was noise, too, a terrible groaning of strained timbers punctuated by crashes of shattering glass. And suddenly he was a part of this world. Throwing his cloak around him, he leapt down from his bunk. He grabbed his sword and axe and held them at the ready. Another attack, he snapped at the crewman. Yes, but this one should be not by the Dark Lord's spawn. This time your weapons should be not of any use to us, young master. Our enemies should be the wind and the sea. Brel punched him gently on the shoulder. On deck, he gestured upwards with his thumb. The sailor moved swiftly, even though the green scepter was shuddering and leaping as the storm threw it from wave to wave. Lone Wolf splashed along behind him, following the paleness of Brel's nightshirt in the gloom. When they came to a ladder leading upwards, the youth took the opportunity to sheath his sword and tuck his axe into his belt. As Brel had pointed out, his weapons were of no use to him now. The three-quarter moon was out, shining widely in a purplish sky. Thin clouds raced across its face, twisting and coiling as the winds drove them. Uncanny phosphorescence gleamed in the crashing wave crests as spray battered across the deck, sweeping men aside as if they were made of straw. The crew were desperately hauling on ropes, trying to lower the sails, acting without instructions because the noise was too overpowering for a human voice to be heard. Lone Wolf felt useless. He looked around for something to do to help, but realized that, in his ignorance, he might simply increase the danger. He was probably the only person who had the time to notice that another light had joined the moon in the sky. At first he thought it was just a very bright star, but as he squinted at it he could see more detail. In a globe of brilliance there was an ancient man, dressed in the blue and silver cloak of the Brotherhood of the Crystal Star. Lone Wolf couldn't make out the man's features, but he could see that his back was bent, as if he had been carrying a great weight and had somehow become locked in that position. Who could it be? Was it a friend or a foe? Lone Wolf hadn't a clue. As he watched, the light suddenly winked out. Kelman was beside him, looking haggard and tense. The captain pulled Lone Wolf towards him and bawled into his ear, "Get off the deck. You're in the way here." Sides, the crew. Kelman waved his hand, and for the first time Lone Wolf noticed that, whenever the sailors had a moment's relaxation from their struggles with the ropes, they were looking at him with hatred in their eyes. "Crew blame you," bellowed the captain above the screaming of the wind and the sharp slapping of the tormented sails. "Cursed voyage. No natural storm. This. Get out of their sight." Lone Wolf was only too glad to obey. He could see the sailors' point of view. Attacks. Sabotage. Now this tempest. Many of their fellows dead, and all of them in danger of losing their lives. As Kelman had put it, the voyage seemed cursed, and one didn't need to look very far to find a scapegoat. He turned towards a welcoming doorway as Kelman rushed off along the deck to help man the ropes. There was a loud crrr clearly audible even through the shrieks of the gale. Lone Wolf looked behind him, but couldn't see anything that might have made the noise. Then instinct made him look upwards. The green scepter's mast had split. Near the top, the uppermost section, perhaps a couple of yards long, was hanging to one side, rocking drunkenly to and fro with the motion of the waves, held on by no more than a few splinters. As Lone Wolf watched, those splinters gave up the contest, and the mass of wood was thrown off, straight towards him. He sprang to one side, throwing up his arms to protect his head. Too slow, too late. The main body of the wood crashed into the deck a couple of feet away from him, but a crossbar struck him just above the right ear. He staggered from the blow. There was something pushing at the back of his knees. Stunned, he attempted to sit down on this object. Whatever it was the guardrail of the deck. His body plummeted into the darkness and was lost beneath the waves' force. She wriggled uncomfortably, unused to the suit of chainmail they had insisted she wear. It seemed to have been designed to restrict her movements in all the most important places. It was also off-puttingly new, sparkling in the damp sunlight, clearly straight from the smithy. Her sword and shield were new as well, although she had refused to part with one of her captured Giac swords, which now hung incongruously at her side. Her hair tickled and itched, crammed into a helmet that wasn't really big enough. Kinifer felt that she looked more like a row recruit than a commanding officer, except, that is, for her horse. Only it wasn't actually her horse. Another source of irritation. It belonged to Lone Wolf, whose presence in her life she was beginning to resent. Still, the beast beneath her was magnificent, huge, white, haughty and highly intelligent. It had been owned until recently by Ulnar's son, the Crown Prince Pelethor, but in the last few moments before he died at the Battle of Alima Bridge he had given it to Lone Wolf. In his flight to Halmgard, Lone Wolf had had to part company with the horse, but it had been able to make its own way home. From the moment she had entered the stables in quest of a steed, it had attached itself to her, recognizing in her, perhaps, something of the same quality that distinguished its new master. She leaned forward now and tickled Janus behind one ear, feeling the rough leather of the horse's armor scratching against the metal of her disgustingly shiny chainmail glove. Behind her, capping the summit of a small hill, was a dense copse, and she could hear from within it the movements of the soldiers under her command, readying themselves for the fray. In ones and twos they had made their way here during the night, trusting in the darkness and confusion to protect them as they penetrated the cordon Zagarna had placed around the city. The ruse had been successful. Only 4 soldiers had failed to arrive and must be presumed dead. The rest had, she guessed, been mistaken for Dracarim or Helgast. Now they were waiting for her command to attack the Dark Lord's forces from the rear. The sun was nearing the horizon. She turned and barked. Half an hour. The noise increased. Not enough to be dangerous, but she scowled nevertheless. Keep quiet, you fools, she hissed to her lieutenant, who passed the order on. Yennefer herself moved Janus a little further back into cover. If they could avoid the attention of the Kron for just half an hour longer. When first it had been reported back to Ulnar's headquarters that the actions of the spawn in Zagarna's army became more lethargic for a brief period around dusk, the king had been skeptical. However, his mind had changed as more and more reports of this phenomenon came in. The reasons for it were uncertain, and didn't seem to be related to any obvious pattern of eating or relaxation. Yennefer's own theory was that it was a matter of habit, that dusk was the spawn's normal feeding time, and that they automatically slowed up a little around then. Like her soldiers, she used the remaining time to take a light meal of coarse bread and smoked fish, carefully tucking the wrappings away in Janus's saddle pouch. She drank some of the rather sickly wine that was made in the region around the capital, and guiltily threw the empty bottle into a bush. She was pleased to find she had no need to urinate. Getting in and out of her chainmail trousers, she had discovered, was a major palaver. She checked that her sword moved easily in its sheath. A distant hilltop had taken a bite out of the sun-swollen disk. The birds were chattering among themselves as they prepared to settle down for the night. A breeze blew up from somewhere, so that the lush grass of the fields in front of her was rippled and tossed. It was very nearly time to attack. She felt the thirst for carnage growing in her, longed for the sweet taste of vengeance as her sword cut through spawn flesh and the itcher flowed. She was impatient for it all to start. She called her lieutenant to her side. His horse came crashing through the foliage. He was a much-scarred veteran and might have expected soon to accede to a command of his own. However, if he felt any resentment about Yennefer's sudden promotion he kept it to himself. In 10 minutes we move. Clan, she said. Tell the soldiers to ready themselves. I just have, he said with an easy smile. She couldn't get over how calm he always seemed. I thought it best to get 'em prepared a little early, just to be on the safe side. Good. The two of them watched in silence as the last arc of the sun disappeared behind the hills. One thing, lady, yes, just. He shifted embarrassedly in his saddle. Well, good luck to you, too. Clan, we'll have some tales to tell tonight. A picture came into her head of a crackling fire and generous measures of warm, strong mead. I share willing, he said quietly. I share willing, she agreed. Again they spent a few moments in silence. Then, Clan, sound the advance. The lieutenant put his bugle to his lips and sounded a single high note. Yennefer touched her hand to Janus's neck and obediently the great white stallion burst into movement. With Clan just behind her, Yennefer sped across the field, feeling her body become almost one with her mounts. Her soldiers poured out of the copse, spurring their horses to the gallop. Her world was filled with the sounds of her armor, Janus's steady breathing, and the thundering of hooves. On the grassy ground, again Clan blew on his bugle, and the sound filled her with exultation. She drew her sword from its scabbard and held it high, hardly noticing that she was screaming with delirious joy as the wind pushed against her face. They came over the crest of a low ridge and saw, not 100 yards away, the outskirts of the besiegers' encampment. Jayaks were drowsily moving about their business, tending the fires, repairing broken armor, stirring great black metal cauldrons of stew. A few Krons strutted among them, pushing them aside with evilly barbed wings. Yennefer was halfway to the camp, her soldiers close behind her. before any of the spawn had the sense to raise the alarm. Immediately the Kron took to the air, fluttering doppily upwards. Some of Kinifer's archers loosed off arrows at them, but as far as she could see none of the big bat-like creatures was harmed. She settled herself behind her shield, and squeezed with her knees to urge Janus to even greater speed. She swooshed her sword in a great circle about her head, yelling wordless threats, and then she was among the enemy. Without mercy she cut down an unarmed Jyak that had been turning to flee. Impatiently she tugged her sword free of its flesh. At the last moment she sensed an arrow coming towards her, and raised her shield just in time to deflect it. Not letting herself think too rationally, she vowed that the archer would die beneath her sword, and adjusted her direction accordingly. With a metal-shod foot she kicked over one of the cauldrons so that its steaming contents spattered across the packed mud, further confusing the Jyaks. Kinifer saw that some of the pieces of meat were only too revoltingly recognizable. A sword lunged at her from beneath and she parried it reflexively, then jabbed her own blade deep into her assailant's head. The Jyak screamed thinly, and Itcher spurted as it died. She put her foot on the dead face and hauled her sword away. She fended off a spear with her shield and chopped brutally downwards to split a Jyak's skull, carrying on the movement to slash through a pair of gyropes. The tent they had been supporting began to collapse gracefully in upon itself. Someone behind her saw what was happening and deliberately scooped up a burning log from one of the fires, throwing it into the center of the billowing fabric, which immediately went up in flames. Jyaks burst out through the blazing cloth and Kinifer ruthlessly cut them down. The archer who had shot at her before had clearly realized she was the most dangerous of the attackers, for it loosed another arrow in her direction, and then another. There was a great rushing sound in Kinifer's ears as she pressed Janus further and further into the fray, her eyes fixed coldly on the Jyak. A Kron tried to attack her from above, but almost casually she severed the tendons at the base of one of its wings, and it tumbled flutteringly down to crash upon an open fire. Its shrieks momentarily distracted her so that she didn't see the next arrow coming. It shot past her face, its feathers cutting open the tip of her nose. The sting of the minor wound incensed her still further, and she vowed with redoubled determination that she would slay that archer if it was the last thing she did in this life. The first shock of surprise had worn off, and the Jyaks were beginning to form themselves up into an untidy fighting array. Reinforcements began to arrive from other parts of the camp, a couple of Gurgas among them. These large reptilian beasts were not only fearsome warriors themselves, they secreted a hormone that sent Jyaks into a blind battle frenzy. Kinifer bit her lower lip in concern, allowing her body to obey its own controls to defend her as she concentrated on this new threat. Her orders had been to cut a swath right through the encampment to the city, causing as much devastation as possible. The aim was not a tactical one. The hope was merely to demoralize Sigarna's hordes by demonstrating that the Somunding of Halmgard were far from powerless. But now she cursed beneath her breath. If they failed in their mission, the whole venture would have the opposite effect. The citizens of Halmgard would be the ones to be demoralized, while the enemy would be confirmed in its collective opinion that the human resistance was at worst a temporary interruption. Added to that was the fact that she and her troops would be well and truly dead, which didn't fit in at all with Kinifer's master plan for the future. She had promised Ulnar she would do anything in her power to preserve the men and women under her command, and she was not a person to treat her promises lightly. Moreover, the death wish that had been upon her in the early days after her family's murder had evaporated. The healthy feel of her moving limbs reminded her constantly how much in love she had fallen again with life. A sharp little Jyak sword, hacking at her leg. The chainmail took the worst of it, but the barbs could penetrate the loops at any moment. She swiftly chopped off her squat attacker's sword arm. The Jyak stared stupidly at the gushing stump, and then burst into tears. The reaction, so very human, astonished Kinifer, and at the same time touched a chord in her heart. She had become accustomed to thinking of the spawn as nothing more than moving objects. It hadn't occurred to her that they might have anything akin to human emotions. Yet this Jyak was obviously weeping not from the pain but out of frustration, like a runner whose ligaments have given out just a few yards from the end of the race. She ended the spawn's misery by chopping its head from its shoulders. There was no time, now, for thought or for pity. She locked her reflections away in a remote compartment of her mind, so that later she could examine them at her leisure, and turned her thoughts to the immediate future. The skirmish was going well, so far as the Somunding were concerned. It was difficult to make out through the melee of battle, but most of her soldiers seemed to be unscathed. She could see Clent struggling with all the ferocity of a cornered wildcat, yet his face was still as calm as if this were just another day's scouting. She envied him. at the same time wondering if that was the way he really felt, or if his face was just a mask concealing the same sort of mental turmoil she herself suffered. Absently she stabbed upwards into Akron's abdomen. The trouble was that things were going to get worse rather than better, especially now that there were Gurgaz present. She was almost upon her archer now, and an idea came to her. She cut her way rapidly through a gaggle of squealing Jayaks until there was nothing between her and the object of her loathing. The spawn was even now notching another arrow to its bow, seemingly oblivious to her presence. Her next move called for skill, and she waited until the moment was precisely right. The Jayak lowered its head briefly and she struck, piercing her sword forwards like a lance, so that its tip plunged straight through the creature's skull. It died instantly, without even a whimper, and as its body crumpled she withdrew her sword and hooked the bow up to her, clumsily catching it on the top of her shield. For the next few seconds she was occupied with beating off other attackers, but then she saw her opportunity to reach down with her sword and stab through the dead archer's quiver. Moments later it was clutched between her right leg and Janus's flank. Using the horse's bulk more than anything else, she forced her way through the struggling mob to a clearer space. Panting from her exertions, she shoved her bloodied sword unceremoniously back into its scabbard and clipped her shield to Janus's saddle. Controlling the horse with her knees, she fitted one of the stubby black Jayak arrows to the bowstring and looked around her for the nearest Gurgaz. She had never confronted one of the beasts before. Now that she came to look at it more steadily, she was horrified by the strength and ruthlessness visible in its every action. If Nar had deliberately set out to design the perfect animated killing machine, then the result might not have been unlike the Gurgaz. She'd been told that they were virtually invulnerable. She'd also been told that Lone Wolf had succeeded in slaying one, which naturally increased her determination to kill more than one. Indeed, as many as possible. She sighted along the shaft of the arrow, speaking soothing words to Janus, knowing the horse couldn't hear her through the enveloping din of battle but hoping that the vibrations of her body would calm him. The Gurgaz seemed to sense her attention, for it turned to look directly into her eyes. The slits of its pupils contracted as it saw her adjust the captured bow, making sure her aim was just as perfect as she could hope for it to be. The arrow seemed to cross the space between them in a timeless no time. One instant it was tensed against the taut string, the next it had embedded itself deeply in the Gurgaz's eye, only its flight still protruding. The Gurgaz let out a shriek, and all around it Jayaks froze into temporary immobility. Clearly she had slain it where it stood. The huge corpse fell face forwards, crushing anything that lay in its path. Hoping her soldiers would follow suit, she urged her horse forwards, dragging her sword from its sheath and scything through the barely moving Jayaks. Shocked by the unheralded demise of their leader, the spawn were too bewildered to put up much of a fight. This isn't battle, she thought ruefully as her sword carved through the unresisting spawn. It's just butchery. Most of the tents in her immediate region were now on fire. Her soldiers were performing acts of individual heroism, and without really meaning to she smiled her approval. Klen was somewhere out of sight, but she could imagine him competently pushing forward through the screaming throngs. Another Gurgaz reared up ahead of her, its forked tongue snaking hungrily between its leathery lips. There were no time for her to seize the bow. She would have to attack it armed only with her sword. She grabbed her shield, not looking, and was reassured to feel its handhold in her clasp. She swung her sword angrily and the blade clattered jarringly off the tough scales of the Gurgaz's side. The beast pulled its leathery lips back from its discolored teeth, almost as though it were grinning at her. Her wrist ached from the shock of the futile blow. Her brain sent a message to it, telling it to stop hurting at once, and to her surprise the pain disappeared. There was salty blood on her lips, blood running down from the wound on her nose. She spat it away. She knew for a certainty she was about to die, about to be snatched up by those massive jaws and ground mercilessly between those voracious teeth. No matter how much her intellect told her this was merely a mental image projected by the Gurgaz, her subconscious accepted the inevitability. She heard again the silence of her father as he had died, and remembered how that scene of savagery, too, had been beyond her powers to alter. Now she could almost feel the teeth digging into her sides as she was hauled up high into the air and she dropped her shield in her left hand, moving around under its own volition, groped for something else to hold. It seized upon the Jayak quiver, a useless object. Useless. Or maybe it wasn't so useless. With renewed energy she began to hack and chop with her sword, aiming the blows at random, not daring to hope to do more than distract her enemy. Most of the blows were wasted ones, but a few struck home, gouging the vulnerable flesh of the Gurgaz's belly. Clearly the beast was becoming irritated by the resistance of what it had assumed would be easy prey. Her left hand worked one of the stubby Jiak arrows out of the quiver and held it in readiness. The Gurgaz leaned its head forwards, its mouth agape, intent on fastening upon the upper part of her body, eager to devour her. She slashed at its tongue with her sword, inflicting a minor wound. Then she forced herself backwards in her saddle, and threw the arrow directly into the Gurgaz's great green throat. The arrow had planted itself deeply in the base of the tongue, its shaft pointing directly upwards, just as she'd hoped. The Gurgaz snarled in pain and anger, closing its jaws and driving the arrow deeper into the soft flesh. Now it howled in agony, and she took the opportunity to draw her sword rakingly across its eye. Her once bright chainmail was spattered with yellow-green jelly as the eye burst open. Still the Gurgaz lived, and its remaining eye focused vengefully on her. She permitted herself to smile at it, mockingly, knowing that despite all her premonitions the fight was nearly over. The beast was facing death, although it didn't know it yet. The only task left for her to do was save her own life. She prodded upwards with her sword, almost gently seeking out the tendons of the creature's throat. Itcher spurted, and she laughed. She tugged on Janus's reins and the horse retreated a few paces, gracefully, leaving room for the Gurgaz to collapse into the welcoming arms of death. The Jayaks nearby became hysterical. Some rocked instantly into a rigor, their sensibilities unable to accept the fact of their leader's death. Others screamed with rudimentary grief and charged forward suicidally to attack their surrounding foes with any weapon that came to hand. There was a great cheer from Kinifer's soldiers as the Gurgaz collapsed in front of her, and she waved her sword high in the air, signaling a mindless triumph she was far from in fact feeling. This was no longer anything even resembling a contest. This was a culling. The Jayaks were now as easy to slaughter as orphaned kittens, and the satisfaction she gained from the chore was no greater. Once, twice, 6 and a dozen times her sword rose and fell, and each time Itcher sprayed over the mound of Jiak corpses building up around her. Her forces soon were making good speed towards the walls of Halmgard, leaving behind them a broad band of destruction. Flames rolled angrily into the sky, their red fury black-edged, and the stench of burning spun flesh was everywhere. The Kron fled from the slaughter, leaving their land-bound comrades to perish in the carnage that Kinifer's troops wrought. If, she thought, I was cutting my way through a forest like this, I'd feel guilty for the branches I was severing. These creatures I'm cutting down must be more than branches, must be, and yet I feel nothing when they die beneath my blade. Yet at the same time I find guilt within me because I am feeling nothing. Still her sword rose and fell, still the Jayaks died. The soldiers faced little by way of concerted opposition after that, although some of their number died. When they drew near to Halmgard's outer defenses there was a yell of welcome from within, and arrows showered down on the surrounding spawn. Out of the corner of her eye Kinifer saw one of her own soldiers spitted by a misdirected Halmgard arrow, and she tasted bile rising in her gorge. The person who had loosed that arrow would sleep well tonight, totally oblivious of the fact that he or she had slain a friend, smug in the satisfaction of having played a part in a triumphant military operation. And there would be others, too, within Halmgard who would feel contented with the outcome of the Dusk Raid, and congratulate themselves for the part they would dream they had played. People who hadn't been out here in the middle of the pain and the stink and the noise. She wished them the worst nightmares she could conceive. And then she was inside the stockade walls, with eager hands pulling her down from Janus's back, soft words huffing and tutting over the tiny wounds she'd sustained. She was barely aware of the fact that the rest of her soldiers were likewise being given a hero's welcome. Once she was sure Janus was being properly treated she pushed her way through the crowds, cursing bitterly at anyone who got in her way, heading for the military quarters and the genuineness of the welcome she knew would be waiting for her there. It was, indeed, a fine welcome. Her fellow soldiers helped her out of her chainmail, and a couple of them urged her into a hot, steaming bath, where with expertly kneading fingers they helped her soothe the aches from her limbs. Once her muscles had fully relaxed they assisted her out of the water and dried her off briskly. Then they, these nameless, almost faceless, attendants of hers, folded her into a toweling gown and led her to where an open fire was crackling and leaping with warmth. This is just like the way I saw it in my mind before the battle, she thought as a mug of mead was pushed into her hands. Now I can start to tell Clem the tale of how I killed not just a single Gurgaz, like Lone Wolf, but 2 of them, and he can tell me of his own valor, and before the night is out I'll have killed 100 Gurgaz with my bare hands, and he'll have been using Jyak swords as toothpicks, and both of us will know how much we're lying but by then we won't give a damn for the truth. She took a long, satisfying gulp of the mead, and felt its warmth working down her throat and into her stomach. She pushed her feet forwards to enjoy the heat from the blazing logs. The air was full of words of praise for her courage and her combat skills, but she ignored them. Some people were sleeping where they were, and most had gone off to bed. When she realized that Glenn still hadn't joined her, she had drunk enough mead that her brain was functioning only slowly, but it gradually became obvious to her that Glenn would not be celebrating their victory tonight, that he would never again celebrate a victory with her. She looked balefully at the fire. Earlier she had smiled approvingly at its warm flames, but now she saw in them the incineration of flailing Jayaks, their miserable unlamented deaths. Glenn was gone. She recognized. That was it. His story was over. Somewhere out in the encampments of the Dark Lord's spawn an arrow had struck home, or the point of a sword had found its mark. The competent smile would now be contorted into a final rictus of pain. She hoped his death had been a swift one. No one saw her as she picked herself up out of her chair and wandered off miserably in search of her bunk.